Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Bom tê-los nesta manhã aqui na Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Josh, I'm going to start in Portuguese and now I'll turn to English, of course we do. Ele precisa de uma... Isso, muito bom, muito
Obrigado.
bom. Professor Renato Janine Ribeiro, bom te ver. Are you ready? Muito bem. O tema não poderia ser mais oportuno e eu agradeço a oportunidade ao Flávio Archel, que é professor aqui da Faculdade de Direito do Lago do São Francisco e que me procurou meses atrás com essa possibilidade do Josh vir à Fundação. Josh veio ao Brasil para um conjunto de palestras, né? Salvo engano, este é o quarto ou quinto evento, o quarto do qual ele participa. Ele é um professor de Direito Constitucional e de Legislação Eleitoral nos Estados Unidos, na Universidade de Kentucky. E, obviamente, que esse tema das eleições americanas nos interessa em qualquer ano. Num ano de eleição presidencial, nos interessa ainda mais. Eu confesso a vocês que, quando aceitei, e aceitei de pronto a sugestão do Flávio, meu pensamento foi o seguinte: essa eleição vai ser muito apertada, vai dar uma confusão dos diabos, né? Controvérsias jurídicas de toda sorte. Nós vamos levar semanas para saber quem é o vencedor da eleição e, portanto, nada mais oportuno do que ter uma pessoa que possa deslindar o que seria, digamos, um assunto das manchetes dos jornais até o dia de hoje, né? Não foi isso. It's not working.
No, they said they're having technical problems.
Technical problems in general, or with this specific equipment?
I have no idea.
I told somebody here that went to see what's happening.
All right. Josh, this is just introductory remarks, so let me finish them. I'm speaking very highly of you. You can be sure about that.
You can say whatever you want
Não,
about me.
Mas, a despeito do fato de que a gente, digamos, teve um resultado claro, não foi o resultado que eu gostaria que tivesse acontecido, mas não importa. Importa que o resultado foi absolutamente claro, não houve controvérsia alguma, mas os temas da legislação eleitoral americana, os temas do papel da Suprema Corte no que diz respeito... No que diz respeito a financiamento de campanha, direito ao voto, são temas permanentes da democracia americana. Diria que, em grande medida, são temas que mostram imperfeições da democracia americana, né? Marcam uma forma peculiar da democracia americana funcionar em comparação com a maioria dos sistemas democráticos no mundo, né? Na Europa, também nos Estados Unidos. É curioso, é um fato menor, mas não é desimportante. Até 2 dias atrás, ou 3 dias atrás, havia ainda um restinho de contagem de votos na Califórnia, né? Então, um processo extraordinariamente prolongado, sujeito a muitas intercorrências, que ainda se desenrola segundo mecanismos que são mecanismos muito peculiarmente americanos. E os Estados Unidos são o maior país do mundo. Então, o que acontece nos Estados Unidos é do interesse de todos nós. Então, eu queria, ao fazer essa breve introdução, eu queria agradecer muito ao Flávio pela oportunidade de ter o Josh hoje aqui com a gente. Já vou lhe passar a palavra, Flávio, mas eu queria, aqui, para não cometer nenhuma imprecisão, eu queria ler a biografia do Josh para vocês todos, né? O Josh é professor, pesquisador da Universidade de Kentucky, do College of Law, da Faculdade de Direito dessa universidade. Ele leciona e pesquisa sobre legislação eleitoral, direito ao voto, direito constitucional, entre outros assuntos. É autor de 2 livros sobre direito ao voto nos Estados Unidos. Eu vou ler os títulos em inglês, não há tradução ainda dos livros, não há edição em português. Vote for US, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. É um título muito eloquente, né? Quer dizer, é curioso perceber que o direito ao voto não é um direito inteiramente assegurado nos Estados Unidos, né? Tem o voting rights dos anos 60, mas tem uma série de brechas para restrição ao voto, brechas essas que são aproveitadas por assembleias estaduais para fazer restrição ao voto de minorias, né? O segundo livro dele, esse é um livro de 19, tem o segundo livro aqui mencionado, é um livro deste ano, que se chama The Court, a Suprema Corte, versus the Voters, The Troubling Story, How the Supreme Court Has Undermined Voting Rights, né? O que para nós brasileiros digamos, tem um impacto grande, a ideia de que a Suprema Corte americana solapou o exercício do direito ao voto nos Estados Unidos. Muito bem, dito isto, nós teremos aqui conosco também para comentar a palestra do Josh, o José Wellington Bezerra da Costa Neto, que está ao lado direito do Josh, que é juiz de direito no estado de São Paulo, mestre em direito comparado pela Samford University, Cumberland School of Law, mestre, doutor e pós-doutor pela USP, foi juiz assessor da Corregedoria Regional Eleitoral de São Paulo e da presidência do Tribunal Regional Eleitoral de São Paulo. A própria biografia do José Wellington frisa, sublinha, ressalta uma peculiaridade brasileira. Nós temos um ramo especializado do Poder Judiciário, que é a Justiça Eleitoral, né? E acho que isto vem de 32, né? Isto vem do primeiro governo Getúlio, era uma das demandas dos revolucionários de 30, a ideia de que precisava de uma justiça eleitoral para acabar com o voto de cabresto, com o voto de bico de pena, com todas as formas de distorção da vontade popular típicas da República Velha. Muito bem, nós levamos muito tempo para que isso, de fato, se tornasse algo mais próximo da realidade, mas o fato de que, em 32, tenha sido criada a Justiça Eleitoral produziu, no longo prazo, os seus efeitos. A gente tem muitas vezes mania de dizer, nós aqui no Brasil, nós lançamos luz sobre os nossos erros, né? Nesse caso, eu acho que vale a pena sublinhar que foi um acerto. Por último, mas não menos importante, a Thaís Bilenque, que acho que muitos de nós aqui conhecemos, né? É uma jornalista importante, colunista do UOL, foi comentarista, participante por anos do Foro de Teresina, é apresentadora hoje do podcast A Hora e Lira, são 2 podcasts, né? E Lira, Os Atalhos do Poder. Na Folha de São Paulo, foi correspondente em Nova York, repórter em Brasília e em São Paulo. Na revista Piauí, como eu já mencionei, apresentou os podcasts Foro de Teresina e Alexandre. Alexandre não é Alexandre o Magno, é Alexandre de Moraes, ministro da Suprema Corte. Né?
Maybe.
It's hard to tell the difference. Muito bem, Flávio, a palavra é sua e depois passamos aos trabalhos.
Bom, muito bom dia a todas e todos os colegas da mesa e da audiência. Bom, vou também tomar a liberdade de falar em português, acho mais confortável para mim e para todos. Josh já está acostumado, já havíamos conversado, quando houvesse tradução, seria dessa forma. Serei brevíssimo aqui. Josh, pode ficar tranquilo, porque enquanto você não tinha a tradução, Sérgio falava muito bem de você, inclusive que você é um corintiano, já se tornou um corintiano. Pé quente, por sinal, foi a arena. Ele apreciou muito, exatamente, senhor. Falou que vocês têm muita coisa em comum. Mas ele destacou que você já é quase um cidadão brasileiro, pelo menos paulistano, já que é um fã do Corinthians, assumido. Mas a minha presença aqui se deve exclusivamente à gentileza do Sérgio. Eu já tinha participado aqui de outros eventos com a Fundação, tenho grande admiração pelo trabalho da Fundação, do Sérgio e de todos aqui. E, como ele explicou, surgiu a oportunidade de trazer o Josh, e eu pensei, além do Tribunal Eleitoral, a faculdade e aqui também a Fundação, que é uma referência para todos nós. Muito rapidamente, o currículo dele já foi lido, o que eu destacaria apenas? O professor Douglas, o Josh, além de ser um estudioso e além de nos trazer, num momento muito apropriado, a visão sobre não só o resultado da eleição, mas principalmente as perspectivas em função do resultado da eleição, ele é um estudioso aberto a aprender com outros sistemas. Ele poderá explicar, Josh deve estar cansado já de eu ficar repetindo isso em todos os eventos, mas eu faço questão, acho importante. Um dos seus projetos é escrever um novo livro, enfim, um trabalho sobre o que os Estados Unidos têm a aprender em matéria eleitoral com outros sistemas. Então, a presença dele aqui também se justifica por isso. E convenhamos, e eu digo isso respeitosamente, não é exatamente uma postura usual essa de se estar aberto nesse contexto. Então, Josh, seja muito bem-vindo. Josh já participou, como foi dito aqui, de 2 eventos na faculdade, só para relatar aqui, ele discutiu a questão do voto obrigatório e do voto do menor de 18 anos. Coisas que para nós não são uma questão, são questão para eles, né? Como foi lembrado, o direito, a garantia do direito ao voto não está na Constituição americana, está nas constituições dos estados, salvo a do Arizona, salvo o melhor juízo. E principalmente, eu acho que é muito rico esse diálogo, esse encontro, porque eles têm uma perspectiva federal. Eles são uma federação. E isso, teoricamente, na minha cabeça, sempre foi uma coisa boa. Mas, em matéria eleitoral, eu tenho dúvidas. Porque, às vezes, eles discutem alguns pontos lá que a gente fala, mas vocês estão discutindo isso? Estão discutindo, por exemplo, identificação de eleitor, estão discutindo questão de lista de eleitor, antecedência de lista de eleitor, estão discutindo financiamento partidário, não digo porque nós estamos discutindo aqui sempre, mas há algumas questões, e isso só se explica porque os estados têm autonomia. Eu brincava ontem no nosso evento, em matéria não só eleitoral, né? Quando se fala sobre direito americano, a primeira maior resposta, assim, depende do estado, né? Então, essa riqueza é muito importante. Ele participou também de um encontro no Tribunal Regional Eleitoral, encontrou juízes. Eu queria também fazer aqui uma saudação à plateia na pessoa do desembargador Valdir Nuevo Campos, que foi presidente do Tribunal Regional Eleitoral, prestigia esse evento. Quero registrar que eu, quando juiz eleitoral, tudo que eu aprendi sobre eleitoral foi o Dr. Valdir que me ensinou. Então, qualquer coisa é com ele. É isso, Sérgio. Muito obrigado e bom evento para todos nós.
Joshua, now you can take off your headphone and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Bom dia. Obrigado. That's about all of the Portuguese I know. But those 2 phrases have gotten me very far in my time here. It is so wonderful to be here in Brazil. Thank you to Sergio, to the foundation for holding this event, to Flavio and the rest of the panelists, to the foundation for having the translation so that I'm able to speak in English and not just say bom dia and obrigado over and over again. And I've had a wonderful time here in Brazil. I've been here almost a week. I hope I don't make any enemies by saying go Corinthians. But I was able to go to a Corinthians match, so and they won. Flavio told me I had hot foot to help them win. So I'm sorry for the Palmeiras fans here, but Corinthians all the way. And I've had a great time learning about Brazil's election system, but also about Brazilian culture, Brazilian food. I've had some wonderful food. I really like pastels. So it's been really a great experience so far. Today, I thought I would talk about the U.S. election system and some issues about elections in the United States. That was the kind of title of this discussion and panel, and tell you about some of the things that I think about a lot in my research and my scholarship on voting rights and electoral law. And I'll have three main topics to discuss. The first is the Electoral College. I'm sure many of you want to know why we have the Electoral College or why we haven't gotten rid of it yet, and how it makes any sense. Well, it doesn't make much sense, but we can talk a little bit about why we have it and some of the proposals to get rid of it. Then we'll talk about the U.S. Constitution and what it says or doesn't say about the right to vote and what the U.S. Supreme Court has done in response. And then third, we'll talk about three big issues that come up all the time in U.S. election rules. We'll discuss voter ID laws, partisan gerrymandering, and the Voting Rights Act, and really what the U.S. Supreme Court has said about those various issues and why they're, I think, big problems for the way that we run our elections. So that's the plan, is to those three big topics, but obviously happy to discuss any other issues of U.S. election law along the way that anyone wants to talk about. We can go to the next slide, and there it is, the Electoral College. So that's our first big topic. And here is the map from the 2024 election that we just had on the Electoral College. You'll see that Donald Trump won 312 electoral votes by winning the various states in red. And Kamala Harris won 226 states from all of the blue states. So why do we have the Electoral College? Well, when the country was founded in the late 1700s and the framers of the Constitution met in Philadelphia to create this new Constitution, they kept having a hard time deciding how to elect the president. They were trying to get away from a system of the king. They had declared independence from the king of Britain for, and the whole point of having a new country. They had the 13 original states, or they were called colonies at the time, and the 13 states were coming together to try to create a new system. And the framers had very strong debates about how to elect the head of the executive branch. Some people wanted a direct election of the president, but the others in opposition said that they didn't necessarily want just the people to decide because that could lead to the people electing someone that was not of good character. The most common proposal actually was to let Congress, the new Congress, choose the president, like in many parliamentary systems. But they wanted independence from Congress. And so they sent several of the framers to a special committee at the very end of the convention to try to come up with a plan. And what they came back with was a total compromise. Basically, no one could agree on either a direct popular vote or Congress deciding the president. So they came up with this idea of the Electoral College. Now, it is true that many states in the South were, in particular, against a national popular vote then because they wanted to protect slavery. So the southern states were slave states that had slavery. They were concerned about this new national government that might abolish slavery, and so they wanted to make sure that they had more influence, including what is famously known as the 3/5 clause in the United States, in the original U.S. Constitution, that said that every person counted for determining apportionment of Congress, how many members of Congress each state has, but then you could also count 3/5 of slaves as, count slaves as 3/5 of a person. That would give the southern states more members of Congress, but because the number of electoral votes you have for electing the president is also based on the number of members of Congress, that 3/5 clause gave the southern states more power as well. And they really wouldn't agree to the new union unless they had outsized influence. The 3/5 clause is obviously one of the most horrible and original sins of the United States government, in calling people only 3/5 of a person that they were enslaved, but it is the unfortunate history there. And so the delegates, it was hot and sticky in Pennsylvania. They didn't have air conditioning back then, and they were trying to find a solution, and the tired delegates came up with this plan, and everyone said, yeah, that sounds fine, because no one liked the popular, not no one, many people didn't like the popular vote, many people didn't like the Electoral College. And so that's the system that we have. Each state has a number of Electoral College votes. The number is equal to the members of Congress in that state, plus the members from the U.S. Senate, so plus 2. So I live in Kentucky. We have 8 Electoral College votes because we have 6 members of Congress and 2 U.S. senators. And that's why every state at least has 3. And so you win the state, you win the Electoral College votes from that state. Now, some people say that this helps to ensure better representation for rural areas in the U.S., for the places in the middle of the country. And it's true that they do get outsized influence just based on population, that it is skewed. If you look at Wyoming and its population, and it gets 3 Electoral College votes, and compare that to California with a much larger population, way larger than 20 times the population of Wyoming, and it gets 54 Electoral College votes. So the votes in California are worth less, just based on the math, than the votes from Wyoming. And it is true, given the politics of the U.S. these days, that essentially the presidential election is determined by 7 states. We call them the swing states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are the kind of 3 biggest, just based on the number of Electoral College votes. North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. You'll see that Donald Trump won all 7 this time around. That did not happen in 2020, and Joe Biden won the presidency basically as a result of these swing states. And so what do the candidates do? They pretty much only campaign in those 7 states. So people who support the Electoral College will say, well, it helps the rural states and make sure that the cities just don't decide the election. But under the current system, only 7 states really decide the election based on the populations of the other states. And what's interesting here is that if you're a Republican in California, you basically think your vote doesn't count because California is going to go for the Democrat given the population. If you're a Democrat in Texas, you basically know your vote's not going to count for president because, again, given the population there's so many more Republicans. But Donald Trump received the most raw total votes of anywhere in the country from California, because there's still lots of Republicans in California, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but he won over 40% of the vote in California. That's millions and millions of votes, and so those people, don't really get representation in the current system of the Electoral College. So that's how it works in the history of it, and the question is, well, can we change it? The U.S. Constitution says that the states can determine the manner of appointing their electors for the Electoral College. So they can decide, and at the founding, many states just had their state legislature do it. The state legislature just said, here's who we want to give our Electoral College votes to, and the U.S. Constitution allows that. You'll notice, by the way, Maine and Nebraska have little dots in them. Nebraska's red with a blue dot, and Maine is blue with a red dot. Those states have decided to award their Electoral College votes by congressional district. So you can, each district, whoever wins that district gets the vote. So the Omaha district in Omaha, Nebraska went to Harris, and there's a congressional district in Maine that went to Donald Trump. And then there's two electoral votes from each state that go to the statewide winner. So those are the only two states that split it up by district. Every state, if you win the state, you win all of the Electoral College votes. And one thing this does is, it looks like Trump won a huge victory, by the Electoral College, 312 to 226. But actually, Trump's victory, if you look at the national popular vote, was extremely slim. He just barely won a majority of votes. And we've had two elections in the past 24 years, in 2000 and in 2016, where the winner of the popular vote did not win the Electoral College. Both times that favored the Republican. The Democratic candidate won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College. Now, I think that if we changed to a popular vote system, the campaign would be different. So who knows who would have won? You change the rules of the game and people's strategy differs. So I'm not suggesting that one of the candidates should have won or be declared the president in 2000 or 2016, the Democratic candidates, and that was Al Gore in 2000 and Hillary Clinton in 2016, because they would have campaigned differently. But it does show you that the Electoral College makes a small victory look like a much larger victory. So Trump right now is claiming a massive mandate to fundamentally overhaul the U.S. government. But actually, the mandate's not that big if you look at the number of votes that each candidate received. All right, so how do we get rid of the Electoral College? That's a common question that I received, both in the U.S. and abroad. So let's go to the next slide. There's a plan called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And here's the idea. Because the U.S. Constitution says that the states can appoint their electors however they see fit, some states have said that they want to award their Electoral College votes to the nationwide winner, regardless of who wins their state. So New Mexico has said, as one of the states that has adopted this plan, California said, doesn't matter who wins our state, we're going to give our 54 Electoral College votes to whoever wins nationally. And the states that have agreed to this have said they won't put it into effect, so they won't actually implement the plan until enough states have enacted it to equal 270 Electoral College votes, which is the number needed to win. That's the majority. You need 270 as the majority of Electoral College votes. So these states have all passed it, but they have not implemented the idea because they don't have enough states to equal 270. They're at about 200 or so Electoral College votes. Now, I want you to look at something. Can we go look at that map? Can we go back to the previous slide? All right, now go to the next slide again. Notice anything here. It's all the blue states that have passed this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The blue states, the Democratic-leaning states, are the ones that, again, have suffered two losses recently by not winning the national popular vote, by winning the national popular vote, but not the Electoral College. So this idea is seen as very partisan, and I don't think it has any chance of passing enough states to equal 270 because the Republicans won't do this, right? They won't go for it because they're winning under the Electoral College system. What we really need to get this enacted is a Republican to win the popular vote, but not the Electoral College. And that almost happened. It almost happened in 2004. So in 2000, Al Gore had the most votes nationwide, but George W. Bush won the Electoral College. 4 years later, it was almost flipped. John Kerry was the Democratic nominee, and George W. Bush was running for re-election. And Bush had the most votes nationwide. If Kerry had won Ohio, which he lost by only about 60,000 votes, if he had won Ohio, then Kerry would have won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. And then you would have had two elections where the popular vote winner and the Electoral College winner were not aligned, but it would have been switched on parties. And I think if that had happened, Republicans maybe would have come on board. But since it didn't, Republicans are not willing to engage in this conversation. Or at least they just reject the idea. Now, even if this idea were to pass, however, I think the Supreme Court would strike it down. I think there'd be a lawsuit, and the court would say that this is unconstitutional. For one, it's a direct attempt to go around the Constitution. The Constitution contemplates that each state will award their Electoral College votes to the winner of the state, or at least district-wide, district by district in the state. And I think that the court would see this as a clear attempt to go around the U.S. Constitution. But perhaps even more concerningly, the U.S. Constitution says that a state may not enter into a compact with another state without federal congressional approval. That states can't enter into agreements with each other without Congress approving. And it's called the Compact Clause. States can't enter into compacts. Well, they called this plan the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. I mean, they literally used the word compact in the title of the idea, which is contrary to the Compact Clause saying that states can't enter into compacts with each other. Now, proponents say this is not like an agreement between the states, like a trade agreement, which is what the Compact Clause was intending to prevent, a trade agreement between states. This is just every state looking at each other and saying we're gonna do this, we're gonna award our Electoral College votes to whoever wins nationally, and we're not going to do it until enough other states do it as well. So we're not into an agreement. We're just looking at each other. But I still think this court would strike down the plan. So the real way to get a change to the Electoral College is a constitutional amendment, which is extremely difficult. You need the approval of 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states. Obviously, that's not going to happen anytime soon, given that only the blue states have enacted this plan. So I think for those who want to get rid of the Electoral College, you have to hope for a Republican to win the popular vote, but not the Electoral College. That's the best way to get the politics such that both Democrats and Republicans would agree to this idea. All right, let's move on to the next slide, and we can talk about the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Constitution. So this is a headline from the New York Times. Does the Constitution guarantee a right to vote? The answer may surprise you. And that's because most people, even in the U.S., think that the U.S. Constitution affirmatively grants the right to vote. If you ask people on the street in public opinion surveys, what are the most important rights within the U.S. Constitution, they'll probably say freedom of speech. They might say freedom of religion. They might say gun rights. Americans love their guns, apparently. And they will probably say the right to vote. But the right to vote is not actually listed as an affirmative right in the U.S. Constitution. Now, voting is discussed a lot, but it's done in the negative. There are various amendments that say no state shall deny the right to vote on the basis of race. No state shall deny the right to vote on the basis of sex. No state shall deny the right to vote on the basis of inability to pay a poll tax. Can't deny the right to vote on the basis of being 18 years or older. So the Constitution actually says to the states, you run elections, and in terms of who may vote in elections on voter eligibility, the Constitution says that those who can vote for the federal Congress are just the same people who can vote for the state legislature. So whoever the state legislature decides is an eligible voter for state elections is also who is allowed to vote in federal elections. But there's no affirmative grant of the right to vote. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court used to robustly protect voting rights in the 1960s through a series of cases in which it said, of course, the Constitution implicitly includes the right to vote, does so through the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause says that no state may deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said, well, that means that if you're going to provide the right to vote, you can't deny it on the basis of these specific characteristics, race, sex, etc., that is in the U.S. Constitution. And the Equal Protection Clause means that you have to give voting rights equally. And through that, the court has said that it would provide a very strong judicial scrutiny to voting laws that are challenged. So if a voter brings a challenge to a election rule, the state has the obligation of showing to a very high degree of what we call a compelling interest that the state has a really good reason for the law and that this is the best way to run elections. So that had been why I think people thought the U.S. Constitution includes an affirmative right to vote, because the U.S. Supreme Court had strongly protected it. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Well, here's what's happened. Through a series of cases over the past several decades, and I talk about this a lot in my book, The Court versus the Voters, the court has pulled back on this strong judicial scrutiny of voting rights and instead has said, no, we're going to defer to the state legislature in the voting rules that we enact. I call this undue deference to states, where the states are given wide leeway to run election rules. Now, here's Justice Neil Gorsuch in a quote about a case involving the 2020 election and COVID, where many states refused to change their voting rules because of COVID. Some states did change their voting rules, and as noted in the introduction, we have a very decentralized mechanism of running elections. Each state can run their elections as it wants, subject to some very basic baseline rules from the U.S. Constitution. And again, before, the court had strongly scrutinized election rules, state election rules. But now, in 2020, you see that Justice Neil Gorsuch writes, the Constitution provides that state legislatures, not federal judges, not state judges, not state governors, not other state officials, bear the primary responsibility for setting election rules. So we have what I've referred to in my scholarship as undue deference to states, where we're deferring to the state politicians. I think this is very highly problematic, because what's the number one goal of someone who wins election? To win re-election. And what's the best way to do that, or at least a good way to do that, is to change the rules of the game to make it easier for your supporters to turn out to vote and harder for your opponents to turn out to vote. And so that's what we see. We see states passing tons of rules, often, especially since 2020, given Trump's false allegations of massive fraud in the 2020 election, which have no evidence whatsoever, but he said it enough times that people believe it. And now you have many states passing more restrictive voting rules as a result. And the court has said, well, if you don't like the rules that legislatures are passing, the solution is to vote them out. There's a democratic solution that the people can decide to vote out the legislators if they're not enacting the types of laws that you like. But of course, in the area of voting, the whole point of these laws is to make it easier for them to win re-election. So it's a difficult solution to say, vote them out if they're passing rules that explicitly make it harder to vote them out. And so we don't have strong protection anymore within the U.S. Constitution for the right to vote because, again, it's not listed explicitly. It's only in the negative. And the U.S. Supreme Court has in my view, abdicated its responsibility for protecting the right to vote and saying the democratic process can solve this. But again, the democratic process can't if the whole point is to make it harder to vote out the current election officials. And this has happened through a series of cases. Let's go to the next slide. So there's the cover of my book, The Court versus the Voters, and I talk about 10 cases in that book. Some of them you may have even heard of. Most people in the U.S., I say how many people have heard of Bush v. Gore, and most people in the room raised their hands because that case essentially decided the 2000 election. I asked how many people have heard of Citizens United, which is a 2010 case about campaign finance, about spending money in elections. Most people in the U.S., when I give a talk about my book, will raise their hands. And then I'll say, okay, how many of you have heard of Anderson versus Celebrezzi from 1983? No one knows that case. And how many have heard of Burdick versus Takushi from 1992? And no one's heard of that case. The importance of those cases is huge because that's where the court began to pull back on strong protection for the right to vote. It didn't say it was changing the law explicitly. It said, we're going to adopt a balancing test where we balance the interests of the state in running elections with the interest of the voter or the burden of the voter from an election rule. But as the cases proceeded, we started to see more and more deference to the state voting rules and less judicial oversight of election laws. Just a quick note about the book that I often like to point out. I wrote it for the general public, so it's full of stories. I tell lots of interesting stories of people involved in these cases. There's even one chapter that includes a tale of murder about elections. There's a chapter that discusses Donald Duck. So there's a lot of stories in here, and I'm particularly proud of that it was listed on a website as one of the top 2024 beach reads about voting rights. I didn't know that was a list of books about voting to read on the beach, but I did see someone reading my book on the beach actually this summer. Okay, it was my wife, but I did see someone reading my book on the beach. And so this is a series of cases, and I'm happy to discuss any of them in detail, in which the court has failed to robustly protect the right to vote, in part because it's not listed in the text of the Constitution. But again, the court had protected it under this idea of equality, but it no longer does in a similar robust manner. In one of the talks yesterday, we were discussing state constitutions. Every state has its own constitution as well, and virtually all of the state constitutions do explicitly grant the right to vote, say things like every citizen of this state shall be a qualified voter. The state constitutions say that all elections shall be free and equal. There's actually a whole suite of rights protected within state constitutions. I've referred to this in some new scholarship as the multi-layered right to vote that state constitutions provide. And so many state courts have actually been very good at protecting voting rights, but some state Supreme Courts have said, yeah, even though our text of the state constitution is different and it goes beyond the U.S. Constitution, we're just going to follow the U.S. Constitution's lead. The U.S. Supreme Court's lead. We're just going to do what the U.S. Supreme Court did on voting rights because that's easier, essentially. So the U.S. Supreme Court's jurisprudence is not only dangerous for how it construes the U.S. Constitution, but when state courts follow what the U.S. Supreme Court did, that's also very concerning. Well, how has this played out in some of the biggest hot-button issues of U.S. election law? We'll talk about three, so let's go to the next slide. And the first is partisan gerrymandering. So we have a district-based system for our members of Congress and single-member districts. So each district gets one member of Congress. We do this for the state legislature as well. Even for city council, under the idea of what we call one person, one vote, which basically means that it should take the same number of people to elect someone from one district as it does to the next district. So each district should be roughly the same size in population. There's also a concern about minority voting rights and minority representation, and so there's a long line of cases with respect to how the districts must be drawn to ensure enough minority representation. But there are no rules about what we call partisan gerrymandering. Now, the word gerrymander is probably very strange in Portuguese. There's probably no translation. The word comes from a political cartoon in 1812 in Massachusetts. The governor at the time was named Eldridge Gerry, Gerry, and it's in the English, it's been changed to Jerry these days. And their political cartoon showed a map that Governor Gerry supported in Massachusetts and put an image of a salamander on top. And the cartoon said this was the Gerrymander, his last name, and the second part of salamander. And so that's the origin of the term gerrymandering. It comes from the governor of Massachusetts who supported this map that had a crazy shape and that looked like a salamander. And what politicians can do, because the politicians in many states draw the lines, is they ensure that each district will have equal population. They ensure that each district, or they try at least to deal with the minority representation, but then they draw crazy shaped districts. So take a look at the 9th district here in, it's the 12th district in North Carolina, that very tiny, thin district. In the litigation over this district, someone said that if you drove, it follows on one part, it follows just a single highway, that if you open both doors of your car and drive down the highway, you would kill everyone in the district. That's how thin it was. Take a look at number 1, District 1, which splays all the way down towards the south, right, to capture. And why? Well, the Republicans drew this district, and what they did is they tried to take as many Democrats as possible and pack them into as few districts so that then Republicans can win more seats. North Carolina is about a 50-50 state, about 50% vote for Republicans and 50% vote for Democrats, and yet the Republicans who controlled the map were able to draw a map that was 10-3, Republican to Democrat. And when asked, the main map drawer, Republican leader in the state legislature, was asked, well, why did you draw a 10-3 map, 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats? And his answer was, well, I couldn't figure out how to do it to make it 11-2. And he was very open about it. Well, why was he so open? Because the U.S. Supreme Court has said that it's not going to deal with issues of partisan gerrymandering, that it's simply not a issue that is necessary for judicial review, that there are no standards for a court to determine when politics has gone too far, because if legislatures are going to draw the lines, everything a legislature does is inherently political, and how can you tell when politics has gone too far in the system? And so we have, and again, they say if you don't like it, then vote the bums out. Well, I mean, how do you vote the bums out here when it's such a skewed map? And so this is really a solution a problem crying out for a solution because the U.S. Supreme Court has refused to intervene. Now, some state courts have done so, but other state courts, including in North Carolina, have not. All right, the next issue we're going to discuss is voter ID. Let's change. And the issue of voter ID in the U.S. is interesting, and when you think of it from an international perspective, because in places like Brazil, my understanding, and in Italy, where I was earlier this year, everyone gets an ID from the government. It's not an issue because even in Italy, actually, you're required, once you have a child, a baby, you have to get an ID for that baby within, I think, the first 3 months of the baby's life. And the government makes it very easy to get. But in the U.S., the government doesn't necessarily make it easy to get an ID. You have to affirmatively go to the ID office. You might have to have certain documentation like your birth certificate, but you might be born in a different state. Americans move around all the time, and you might not have a copy of your birth certificate, and you might have to pay the state where you were born to get that birth certificate. In fact, many African Americans born in the South, they're older now, but didn't have a birth certificate because they were born at home, and they never got registered with the state. And so there is a small but significant population of people that simply don't have an ID. And it varies based on the state, and state rules on voter ID are different. Some states have a very strict law, that is to say that not a lot of kinds of things count. So Texas is a good example of this, where a student ID issued by the University of Texas, a public institution, does not qualify for voting. Now, Texas does say that your gun license does count for voting purposes, and if you want to think about the politics here, where, well, Republican state, people think students are going to vote more Democrat, so let's make it harder for those people. But gun owners are more Republican, so we'll let them use their gun license. Currently the law. Yeah, your gun license counts for voting for a voter ID, but not your student ID. And the reality is that there are people who simply don't have an ID. They don't have a driver's license. They take public transportation to work, and they might have to take off work to go get the ID. Well, this issue's gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, and you might be understanding the theme right now. What does the court say? We defer to the state. Just like in partisan gerrymandering, we defer to the state. In the voter ID, we defer to the state as well. So the court refused to invalidate the voter ID law. That case that went to the court was about Indiana's law in 2008. And the court said, we defer to the state's rules. And that causes disenfranchisement of certain people. Finally, we'll talk very briefly about the Voting Rights Act. We can go to the next slide. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is one of the most important laws ever passed by the federal government to protect minority voting rights. And we're not going to go into unless you want during the Q&A to go into the details of what the law does, but it's sufficient to say that the law required states to ensure that their voting rules would not harm minority voters. However, in recent years, in a couple of different cases, the court has pulled back on the protection of the Voting Rights Act by striking down various provisions of it. Again, under the idea of we defer to the states in their voting laws. And so this has caused a lot of harm in terms of the ability of states to pass new restrictive voting rules. In dissent in one of these cases, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote that throwing away part of the Voting Rights Act or invalidating part of the Voting Rights Act is like throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, which I think is a very powerful image, right? The majority said, well, we elected a black president, Barack Obama, so you don't necessarily need the protections of the Voting Rights Act. But the protections of the act were making sure that states could not pass restrictive voting rules. And so it's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Well, what happened after the court struck down these rules? States started passing more restrictive laws. And again, the court has said, we defer to the states. Let's go to the last slide. So here are the covers of my 2 books and my contact information. I also started a podcast and radio show this year called Democracy Optimist. So it's sort of strange for me to give a talk about how horrible the U.S. Supreme Court is on voting rights and yet call myself a democracy optimist. But I think that we need to be optimistic even in the face of challenges to voting rights and challenges to the election rules, because otherwise, if you're not optimistic about what is possible and having these kinds of conversations, you're just going to throw up your hands and say the system can't be fixed. And so I try to think about solutions, think about what we can do in response to these challenges, because otherwise, democracy won't sustain itself by itself. With that, I thank you all so much for listening, and again to the foundation and to Sergio, and I'm really looking forward to the comments.
Josh, first of all, thank you so much for your comprehensive presentation. Before giving the floor to José Wellington, let me just make one remark. On August, I guess it was on August, we held a meeting with Levitsky, Stephen Levitsky, the Harvard professor.
Democracies die.
Yeah, and his most recent book is The Tyranny of Minority in the U.S. And he and his co-author, David Ziblatt, I guess, touched on various of the topics you've raised here, restrictions to voting rights, and their main thesis is there is a social and political force behind all these measures to restrict rights of minorities, especially black minorities and also Latino minorities, and it's so white-dominated Republican Party. So just to mention that I'm not saying that I necessarily subscribe to that thesis. Honestly, I do, but this is not the point. I just recommend that if you have the time, just go to our website, and we have recorded his lecture. It's worth watching it, listening to it. So without further ado, José Wellington, your comments, you can do in English or in Portuguese, whatever you want.
Obrigado. Eu vou saudar a todos em português e aí passo os meus comentários aqui em inglês. I'm going to just read them in Portuguese and go to the comments and questions in English. Okay. Muito bom dia a todos, uma satisfação estar presente à Fundação FHC. Minha gratidão e meus cumprimentos aqui ao Sérgio Fausto, nosso anfitrião. Saudar com muita alegria também a Thaís Bilenque e a satisfação em conhecê-la. Também o professor Flávio, e agradecer a ele que foi essa ponte para que eu pudesse participar desse evento. Fico muito honrado em ter sido incluído nos planos aqui de participação do professor Joshua nos eventos no Brasil. Saudar aqui meu nobre amigo, desembargador Novo Campos. Satisfação tê-lo também na plateia e na sua pessoa. Saúdo a todos os demais presentes. So, I'll take my remarks in English, and I apologize in advance for any failures in my speech. I'm going to touch some issues that I think are like hot in Brazil and also in U.S. elections. Some of them we talked about yesterday at lunch. In your book, Vote for U.S., surprisingly, I find out that some of our concerns are also our concern here in Brazil. And I listed at least 4 points that came to my attention. The concern with the election system in danger. Secondly, money influences and finally decide the results. Third place, younger voters does not take part as they think not worth the effort. And the accusations that the system is rigged in some way. And we see these same concerns and speeches here in Brazil. And my first question, and I quote your book on page 215, you say, "We fail to nurture a culture of participation among our youngest voters." Why do we think that somehow it's the legal community or even the judiciary system, our responsibility to push voters, younger or not, to election? Not take part is not also a rational and voluntary decision. Last election in São Paulo, we registered 2.9 million absences, while the second place registered in his favor 2.3 million votes. So we had more absences than the vote registered for one candidate, the second place candidate. So the historical record in the US, it's about 60% eligible voters to show up for voting. So it seems the absence is quite a common phenomenon in both systems. And when we find out that our mandatory voting system does not make people go to ballots. Do you think this is made it mandatory is the way to solving this issue, as we have the same problem we reported? So these are my first comments. I wanted also to touch another important issue in Brazil, which is financing campaign. We talked about that on lunch yesterday. And in Citizen United, a landmark case you mentioned in your lecture from 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the prohibition of all independent expenditures by corporations and unions violated the First Amendment clause of the Constitution. So this was very much criticized as empowers the lobbyists and the wealth power to influence elections. In Brazil, we had historically allowed the corporations to finance campaigns, and we have also a statutory provision for that, and the law that that establishes the parties regime. Brazil Supreme Court held that unconstitutional, and lots of arguments were pointed out, but I want to highlight three of them. Brazil Supreme Court said that corporations are not citizens, so as they cannot vote and not be voted for, they should not be able to finance campaigns. Corporations to finance campaign also inflates the cost of campaigns, and they also held that that imbalance the campaigns and the electoral process at all. What are your thoughts on that issue? As Brazil Supreme Court and U.S. Supreme Court seems to went opposite ways on that issue, does the bearing of such donations effectively violates the free speech, or bearing them grants the speech to be really free from financial capture? And I also attach an interesting phenomenon we have seen here in Brazil on the last elections. Corporation, the facts, in the case Citizen United, the facts meant pointed to a corporation that wanted to be candidate, wanted to register for be a candidate, and as you explained yesterday, the court went sideways to not allow this to happen. But in Brazil, the court actually faced the issue. But we have seen in last elections what you can call maybe collective mandates. So we have one person who runs for an office, but I mean, his campaign is clearly stated that they have a bunch of people behind him. So he's going to be the candidate, but he represents 10, 20, well, many people behind him. So the phenomena are just the same. You have a collective being desire to exercise a single spot representative mandate. How would you respond to that? What are your thoughts on this? And as long as we're talking about financing campaign, there is another issue that I think is very essential here, which is public funding of campaigns. In our system, we frequently held that public funding of campaigns is like immoral. You have money that will go to health, education, other essential stuff that goes to politics and to representatives and politicians to spend on campaigns. It seems like in your book, I found out you support public funding as a way of getting rid of wealth influence. So how would you comment on that dilemma? So these are my first remarks, and I apologize again for my English. I hope you could understand everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, so Ellington. If you don't mind, Joshua, why don't we let Thais comment, and then you take both comments at the same time? Is that all right for you, or would you like to comment on to answer José Wellington's questions first?
Your plan is fine.
All right. So, Thais.
Então, tá bom. Bom dia. Obrigada, Flávio, pelo convite. Sérgio, por me receber aqui. É um prazer estar na mesa com Joshua e José Wellington. Bom, me ocorreu, enquanto eu te ouvia falar, Joshua, que a diferença talvez mais essencial e central do sistema brasileiro com o sistema americano é que, no Brasil, o voto é obrigatório e universal, embora ele não seja tão democrático quanto se pretendia, possivelmente, ao torná-lo assim, dessa maneira, obrigatório e universal. E isso acontece por alguns fatores, e não um só, exclusivamente, e eu elencaria o fato de haver, hoje em dia, 2024, compra de voto da maneira mais escancarada que se pode se esperar, mas não só. Temos também coação, que induzem eleitores a votar de determinada forma, seja para preservar seu emprego, seja para não ser ameaçado por alguma facção criminosa. E não precisa ir muito longe, não estou falando de nada muito alienígena. A gente sabe que um dos mais ruidosos, talvez, empresários do Brasil, que é o Luciano Hang, que é dono de uma rede varejista chamada Lojas Avan, está sendo processado, foi processado exatamente por coagir os seus milhares de funcionários a votarem em determinado candidato, que era o candidato que ele apoiava, inclusive financeiramente. E isso acabou na Justiça, porque foi um caso flagrante de coação. Então, é um voto universal, mas não tão democrático assim, não necessariamente tão democrático assim. E tem também um terceiro aspecto que torna o voto no Brasil não tão democrático assim, que é uma politização incipiente, de maneira geral, da sociedade brasileira, que acaba sendo suscetível, em muitas vezes, e eu acho que nas eleições municipais isso fica muito claro, ao voto que a gente costuma chamar aqui de eleitoreiro, que é o prefeito ou o vereador faz uma obra na véspera da votação, asfalta uma rua, contrata um funcionário, põe um poste de luz a mais na frente da casa de determinada região, de determinada rua, e aquela população se sente contemplada como se aquilo fosse o papel do seu representante, porque também não tem tanta clareza de qual é o papel do seu representante. Então, é um voto um pouco automatizado. Isso se deve a um projeto mesmo nacional de politização ou falta de politização da sociedade brasileira, que é uma coisa recorrente, décadas e décadas assim. E daí o que a gente costuma muito dizer na crônica política, que é o que eu faço, né, como jornalista que cobre isso, que é o poder da máquina na influência do voto popular. Então, o status quo, o poder incumbente, né, a pessoa que está exercendo o mandato e disputa a reeleição ou lança um candidato para sucedê-la, sai na frente nessa disputa pelo voto, porque muitas vezes consegue influenciar com medidas pontuais, mas que vão decidir o mandato seguinte, os próximos 4 anos, com uma obra ou alguma medida muito cirúrgica e muito, enfim, pouco abrangente no sentido do direito ao voto de fato. E a fiscalização, como o Brasil é um país de dimensões continentais, menor que os Estados Unidos, mas igual muito grande, muito cheio de rincões, onde é muito difícil o acesso humano, de fato. Então, Brasil afora, a fiscalização de crimes eleitorais é muito complicada, e isso também aprofunda esses buracos, essas falhas da democracia, do voto democrático como se pretende, né? Como ideal, o voto democrático ideal. E aí faz com que o voto no Brasil, embora assegurado constitucionalmente, não é totalmente o que assegure a democracia, e muito mais, ele é o voto no Brasil, a combinação, né, do poder do status quo com essa formação política que se tem no Brasil, por uma escolha daqueles que foram eleitos, inclusive, né, tanto na formação de currículo quanto na forma de se comunicar com os eleitores. E a gente tem exemplos muito recentes disso, seja Bolsonaro em 2018, seja Pablo Marçal, que foi o candidato a prefeito de São Paulo nesta eleição, agora 2024. São Paulo é a maior cidade do Brasil, é uma cidade cuja eleição para a prefeitura tem reflexo nacional, e a gente teve um candidato que quase foi para o segundo turno, ele teve 1/3 dos votos, por uma diferença ínfima, ele não passou. E a grande promessa dele era fazer a população mais pobre prosperar. E ele não tinha nenhuma medida concreta para cumprir essa promessa e, no entanto, convenceu 1/3 dos eleitores. Tanto ele quanto o Bolsonaro, na campanha que venceu, tinham e têm um discurso contra o sistema, querendo detonar a legalidade do sistema eleitoral brasileiro e do sistema político, a legalidade mais do que isso, a legitimidade do sistema político brasileiro. E na eleição de 2022, em que o Bolsonaro disputou a eleição e quase ganhou, foi também uma margem mínima de votos, boa parte do enfrentamento a essa ofensiva contra o sistema eleitoral foi feita pelo Tribunal Superior Eleitoral, que é como se fosse a Suprema Corte Eleitoral no Brasil, e que era presidida, na época, por um ministro do Supremo que você conheceu ontem, que era o Alexandre de Moraes. E muita gente, inclusive dos seus adversários, atribuíram ao ministro Alexandre de Moraes a resistência à destruição da legitimidade das eleições. O que mostra que, se temos no Brasil, diferentemente dos Estados Unidos, assegurado em lei e na Constituição o direito ao voto e a preservação das instituições brasileiras para garantir o acesso universal à urna, ao mesmo tempo, estamos muito suscetíveis a intempéries e candidatos que, se não fosse um ministro ou uma situação específica, poderiam ter vencido e mudado o curso da história no Brasil. Então, também sou muito otimista, como você, e fica assim minha provocação aí para dizer que talvez o voto popular é um bom caminho. Evidentemente, ninguém está aqui para destruí-lo, mas ele não garante toda a democracia plena de um país.
Muito bom, Thaís. So, back to you, Josh, to answer all the questions. If I may, I would. You said at the end of your presentation that you're particularly concerned in having conveying the message that there are things that we can be done, right, to improve the U.S. electoral system. And I would like to hear from you examples of things that can be done realistically that can be done. Let me just mention one, which is the Voting Rights Advancement Act, was tabled by the author. I think it's John Lewis, the famous civil rights black activist that later in life became a House representative in the House, right? So give us some examples of what can be done. The second thing is there a scholarly debate in the U.S. about the role of the Supreme Court? I know it is, but the right has organized itself, and there is a famous organization called the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies, right? Which, as far as I know, has great influence in forming new judges, from law schools to courts at various levels, right? Is there anything comparable on the other side of the aisle, so to speak?
All right. How long do I have?
You have an hour and a half now.
All right. Very good. Obrigado. Bom dia. All right. Great questions. Thank you for all of those remarks and has given me already a lot to think about. So I'll go in order of the questions as I heard them. And the first from Jose Wellington about what I wrote in my book on the fact that we fail to nurture a culture of participation, particularly among young people. And there's a few things, I think, in response. So when the U.S. declared independence from Great Britain, we wrote the Declaration of Independence, a very important document to U.S. law. And one of the things that the Declaration of Independence says is that a government is not legitimate except for based on the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed is the entire key to democratic legitimacy as the foundation of the U.S. system. And so I think when we have elections where 60%, 65% turn out for the presidential election, but during our midterm elections every 2 years after the 2 years after the presidential election, when we elect members of Congress, turnout is usually below 50%. In my state of Kentucky, we have what we call off-year elections, where we elect our statewide governor in odd-numbered years, and that's the only thing on the ballot that year is the statewide offices. And turnout is usually 25 or maybe 30%. So in a close election where you have 30% turnout and the winning candidate gets then just over 15% of the eligible electorate to vote, that's not the consent of the governed. So I think that we need to rethink the way in which we engage people to demonstrate the importance of democratic participation. Now, Jose Wellington also mentioned how not taking part can be an intentional decision, right? That perhaps some of the non-voter turnout is because people don't want to vote. And I think that could be part of it. I think there's apathy. I think that, as we mentioned earlier with respect to the Electoral College, Republicans in California and Democrats in Texas think, why bother voting? Because, at least in the presidential election, my vote won't count. Unfortunately, I don't know if this is the same issue in Brazilian politics, but turnout in the local races is the lowest, and yet those are the races that have, or those offices are the ones that have the biggest influence on people. School board and how the quality of the schools, your local government and how your roads are paved or all of the various things that local governments do, those impact people a lot more than the presidency. And yet people vote much higher for the presidency than for their local offices. So yeah, I think there's some voter apathy, but I also think that many of the rules that we have in the U.S. make it harder for some people to vote. And I'll give you just one example. We have different rules across the states with respect to voter registration, having to get on the voter rolls. Some states automatically put, and this is kind of a new phenomenon over the past decade or two, but some states automatically put every person that they know of, every eligible voter, on the voter rolls through a system called automatic voter registration, where they get the lists from the driver's license office or other government offices, and those people are automatically registered. Some states have what we call same-day voter registration, where you can go to the polls and bring your documents and register to vote and then cast your ballot on the same day. But other states have deadlines before the election by which you have to be on the voter rolls. So in my state of Kentucky, if you don't register 29 days before the election, you can't vote. And most people aren't paying that close attention to the elections, such that a month beforehand they know they need to check their voter registration, especially when you have rules that say, for example, in some states, if you don't show up for 2 consecutive elections, so that's just 4 years, then the state automatically removes you. Well, you say for whatever reason you decided not to vote in 2020 and 2022, well, then you go to the polls in 2024 to vote, and your name's not there anymore. And if there's a 29-day voter registration deadline, you're out of luck. The same thing goes with vote by mail. We have a very strong tradition of postal voting. I know that that doesn't exist here, but we have a strong tradition dating from the Civil War, when actually Abraham Lincoln promoted vote by mail for soldiers as they were fighting the Civil War. And he really did it because he wanted to win re-election in 1864 and knew he needed the Union soldiers to help him vote. When I teach this, and I don't know if this will translate, we'll try. When I teach this at my election law class, I talk about how Oregon was the first state to use vote by mail. But when I first started teaching it, I said, Oregon has an interesting system. They have all mail voting. And then the women in the room looked at me like I was crazy, because male as in men versus women. And that's why I make sure I say vote by mail instead of all mail voting. So that's expanded, and particularly during the pandemic. And yet some states make it harder to vote by mail. You need a specific excuse. You have to sometimes get a signature notarized. So if you want to cast a mail-in ballot, you actually have to find a notary to verify your signature. And what do we know? If you look at voter turnout across the states with easier voting rules, same-day registration, voter registration, automatic voter registration, robust vote-by-mail policies, they tend to have higher turnout. And the states that have more restrictive policies have lower turnout. So I'm not sure that not taking part is solely an intentional decision. I think that can explain some of the lack of voter participation, but certainly not all of it. And then you asked, could mandatory voting solve the issue in the U.S.? Well, I think it's going to be hard to enact mandatory voting in the U.S. Americans don't like the government telling them what to do. So I think the politics of it are very difficult. Although there are some cities that are looking at mandatory voting, some cities in Connecticut and in Washington State that are looking into the possibility of the idea. But what I've learned so far this week in Brazil, in my own scholarly impression of what I've learned so far, is that Brazil doesn't necessarily make it all that easy to vote, especially if you're going to be away from your home on election day. But you make it really easy to fill out an excuse for not showing up. There's an app that you can just, boom, click a button, and you get your excuse. And I compare that to Australia, where, and also the fine for not voting is very small here. Australia, the fine is about $25 US, so that's a lot more obviously than here. And they make it a little bit harder to provide the excuse, and their turnout is typically above 90%. So I think there are lessons for even better ways if the U.S. were to move toward, or some cities in the U.S. were to move to a mandatory voting model. I think we would want to borrow a little bit more from Australia, perhaps, than Brazil. Although I will say it's interesting to me that even though voting is not as expansive in terms of the ability, the different mechanisms to do it here, and it's easy to fill out the form for an excuse, you still have turnout at 80%. Right? So that I think that says something about the culture of participation that is perhaps lacking in the U.S. Next, on campaign finance and Citizens United, and the difference between the U.S. Supreme Court and the Brazilian Supreme Court on this issue. Here, I think you all were correct that corporations are not citizens, and so therefore should not have the same rights as individuals to participate in elections. Now, the Citizens United case said that corporations have a First Amendment right of free speech to participate in elections by spending money. And this really dates back to a 1976 case called Buckley versus Vallejo. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, essentially, money equals speech. That spending money is a form of speech. And the rationale was, yeah, you could go out into the park and scream all you want, but not a lot of people are going to hear it. So if you want to have free speech in a way that people actually hear, you need money to disseminate it. I mean, even if you want to print out a pamphlet to hand out, that requires money to print it. And the court said that essentially money equals speech. I think this is wrong. I think there's lots of reasons why this doesn't make sense, that the spending of the money is not the same as the speech act. Money facilitates speech, perhaps, and helps disseminate it, but it is not speech itself. But to undo the harms of Citizens United, I think you need to go actually back to that 1976 case of Buckley versus Vallejo and undo that concept of money equals speech. And a lot of people in America think of the Citizens United decision as saying that corporations are people. And the court didn't actually say that explicitly. In fact, the law in the U.S. has thought of corporations as a fictional person for a very long time for purposes of, for example, being sued. You can sue a corporation, and corporations can violate rights, and the way that the law has understood that is through this legal fiction of corporations are tantamount or similar to people. But it doesn't mean that they are the same as people for spending money on campaigns. Now, you mentioned, I told you the story, I opened my chapter in my book on Citizens United with this story, where this individual who owned a corporation, it was a marketing company, an advertising company, heard about the Citizens United decision in 2010, and he thought, well, if a corporation can spend money on campaigns, why can't they run for office? So he filed candidate papers as his corporation, Murray Hill Incorporated. He created an ad that said it's a new day in America. Corporations built this company, and it built this country, and now they're going to run it. Had a picture of a person in a business suit, but the logo of the corporation on the head. He ended the ad with, "I'm Eric, the designated human for this corporation, and I approve this message," which you always, at the end of ads in the U.S., you have to say who the candidate is and that you approve the message. And the election officials in Maryland, where he ran for Congress, got these papers, and they were like, well, what do we do with this? We can't really let a corporation be a candidate for office, but they couldn't figure out how to get out of it. And then they realized that the corporation was only 5 years old. It had been incorporated only 5 years prior, and then therefore it was not old enough to serve in Congress under the U.S. Constitution's eligibility rules. So they kicked him off on that basis. I guess he has to wait some more years to file again. So it's a big problem, and why is it a big problem? You know, the U.S. Supreme Court's theory of free speech in general is more speech is better. That if you don't like the speech, just add additional speech, counter speech. The problem is that when you have wealthy interests flooding the airwaves, there's no space for anybody else. Even with the internet and the unlimited amount of space on the internet, there's only a limited space of attention, of the ability of people to understand or to hear the various messages. And so you do have, and Democrats are doing it just as much as Republicans. In fact, the past 2 election cycles, Democrats have spent more money, and wealthy interests in favor of Democrats have spent more money. But it's a big problem. So you asked, would public funding of campaigns help? I think the answer is yes, except the Supreme Court has held that the government cannot require public funding of campaigns. It has to be voluntary, because always with public funding of campaigns, there's a limit on how much private money a candidate can raise. And because, again, money equals speech, the Supreme Court has said that a candidate has to voluntarily agree to give up spending private money. The government can't coerce that, because that would be limiting their speech. And we've had some really interesting innovations of public financing of campaigns. New York City gives candidates a 9-to-1 match. So you raise, $100 from donations, and the government will give $900 to your campaign to spend. And there's a bunch of other restrictions that the candidates must follow. But my favorite is out of Seattle, Washington, where they have a system they call democracy vouchers. So the candidate who signs up, again, it has to be voluntary, but every candidate who signs up for public financing is given the right to raise money through the people. So every citizen in Seattle is mailed 4 vouchers worth $25 each that they can give to the candidates that they prefer, for the candidate to then turn in to the city to get the public funding. So candidates go door-to-door campaigning for votes, but they also go campaigning for these democracy dollars, these vouchers, and this lets people who are, of lower socioeconomic but poorer people donate to campaigns. People who had never donated to campaigns before can donate because they're given the funds and the ability to decide who gets the money. And what you see is different kinds of candidates who don't have wealthy friends or aren't backed by wealthy interests, teachers, run for city council and have had some successes. Now, it's hard to go up against a privately financed candidate who's raising millions, but Seattle has seen some successes on the public financing front. So I do think it is a potential. It's not it's not going to solve everything, but at least one viable solution for the financing of campaigns and the wealthy interests that influence U.S. elections. All right, moving to the questions of vote buying and undue influence and election crimes essentially becoming worse. That all goes to a general question about the legitimacy of the system. And one of the benefits of the U.S. system being so decentralized is that it's really hard to unduly influence the result, because you've got to be in thousands of jurisdictions at once to somehow rig the election to change, if you're talking about the presidential election or a statewide election. We have local control over elections. And so you'd have to influence the thousands of different local jurisdictions to do it. We also have a very strong system of post-election audits. So I know in the introduction you mentioned that California is still counting votes. That's true because California has a ton of vote-by-mail ballots, and they let ballots, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day, they let ballots arrive after Election Day, and they're still valid. But they also, every state goes through a post-election audit where they look to verify the results, and there's various steps along the process. And this is a good way to figure out and make sure that the election system is secure. So in 2018, there was a congressional election in North Carolina where during the audit, the election officials saw something kind of strange. They were comparing the vote totals of people who voted in person in certain neighborhoods of this district with the vote by mail, the absentee ballots. And what they saw was that the Democratic candidate, I don't remember the exact numbers, so I'll just give easy numbers. The Democratic candidate received 80% of the votes of people who voted in person, but only 20% of the votes of the people who voted by mail. And nothing really could explain that. Like, how do you explain a candidate doing so well for people who decided to show up at the polls on Election Day, but really terrible for people who filled out an absentee ballot? And so they started investigating further, and they actually found that there was a bunch of voter fraud, that there's one Republican operative had gone door to door at an elderly community and basically convinced people to give him their ballots, and then he filled out the ballot for them. And so the election officials threw out the results of the election. So that's all to say that we have a lot of checks in our system to make sure that not only because it's so decentralized, but that the election officials don't certify the results. I sort of when my friends who are not lawyers say, well, I want to know the results right away. Give me the results on election night. And I'm the annoying law professor when I say, well, election results aren't actually official for a month because we spend a month or so going through this whole post-election process. And I tell them, look, election night results are just media projections. And I love the media, but the media doesn't always get things right. Usually they do, and especially on the results, and we've got a better reporting system. But in 2000, the media called the election for Al Gore and then George Bush, and then took it away and said it's too close to count, too close to call, and so we have this whole system that helps to ensure the legitimacy of the elections. The other thing I'll say is that people are looking for fraud a ton. Because of the rhetoric of fraud in U.S. elections, we're really looking for it, and we haven't found it. Besides isolated incidents like the North Carolina example, it really just doesn't happen, and it's really hard to prove that to people because how do you prove a negative, right? How do you tell someone that the thing does not exist? I sometimes use the example or story of when my kids were younger, and they might say, "Daddy, there's a monster under the bed." And, I'll keep looking for that monster, but how do I prove them besides, look, we're not seeing any monster. How do you prove that it's not there, right? How do you prove the negative? But what I can say is that we're looking at it really closely because people keep claiming it exists, and we're not finding the monster. Finally, Sergio, on what we can do to protect the U.S. election system, the Voting Rights Amendment Act, the Federalist Society. So there's lots of things, and we'd need another hour and a half for me to talk about all of the various proposals. But what I'd say is that local laws in this environment where I think we can't rely on Congress to pass stronger election rules and we can't rely on the U.S. Supreme Court to protect the right to vote, local laws are the key. So, in earlier panels during my trip to Brazil, we talked about voting at 16. Well, there are about 8 cities in the U.S. where 16 and 17-year-olds can vote for either all local elections or just school board elections. We have more robust vote by mail policies. That started at the local level first and then spread to other cities and eventually statewide. Some places now use a system of voting called ranked choice voting. So instead of having to choose one candidate among many, you can rank order your preferences. I like this person first, this person second, this person third. That has a lot of benefits for how the campaigns are run. It helps to give a better sense of the electorate's views on the best candidates. Well, that started in San Francisco. Actually, the guy who wanted to promote it went to local bars in San Francisco and got the attention of the crowd and said, hey, let's all rank order our favorite beers to show how people have preferences. And just because your first preference might not be available or might not be the best choice, you'd get your second preference instead. And then it spread to Minnesota, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Paul, Portland, Maine. Now it's used statewide for Maine elections, for elections in Alaska, and other states are considering it as well. So you can have reforms and try them out at the local level. They can spread to other places, eventually statewide. That's in fact how we got women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment, which allow women to vote, started at the local level where places let women vote in school board or local elections to certain states, and then there was a tipping point where we got a constitutional amendment. So I think the key in this environment is to focus on some of those local reforms. I don't think Congress is going to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act amendment because of the politics. The Republicans have now taken control of both, or will in January take control of both the House and the Senate, and they have no interest. That law would undo a lot of the harms of some of the Supreme Court decisions I mentioned on the Voting Rights Act, but I think that is unlikely. But I do think that one of the lessons here is for the two sides to have to come together. If there's one, again, I'm an optimist, if there's one silver lining of the Supreme Court being horrible on voting rights, is that it means we need to double down in bringing Democrats and Republicans together to try to find solutions, bipartisan solutions. And we did this in Kentucky, actually. We passed some voting rules that the Republicans and the Democrats agreed on, and it was really because we had a pro-democracy Secretary of State who runs our elections, who thought it's better for democracy to have Republicans, Democrats, a law professor, I got to be part of these debates, organizations in the room to help decide what makes sense. And I often say that, you know, many places in the U.S., one side decides the rules, and they're the judge and the jury, or if you want a football analogy, imagine that Corinthians and Palmeiras were playing a big match, but Palmeiras got to decide not only who the referees were, who happened to be Palmeiras supporters, but also the rules of the match. No one besides the most closed-minded Palmeiras fan would think that's fair, and that's kind of how we do elections in the U.S., and so we need to think of bipartisan reforms. Finally, you asked about the Supreme Court and the Federal Society. There is a counterpart organization called the American Constitution Society. It doesn't have as much money behind it as the Federal Society does, so I think it hasn't been as successful. Its executive director is a former U.S. Senator, Russ Feingold, Democrat from Wisconsin. So they are, in a large part of these debates, but they're not as well-funded.
Right. Thank you so much, Josh. The thing is, people were silent until recently, and then they had a change of heart, and I got a flood of questions here. So can we go like 10 minutes longer, and so that we can have time to for you to address some of
Eu queria
this.
só fazer uma colocação aqui antes, porque é preciso dizer, e hoje em dia mais ainda, que o sistema brasileiro, o sistema eleitoral brasileiro também é muito seguro. E também aqui se tentou provar fraudes e falhas, se tentou muito mais do que isso e não se conseguiu. Então, se a gente discute a profundidade da democracia do voto brasileiro, a gente está sofisticando muito a discussão sobre o voto popular e a democracia no Brasil, mas de longe a gente está passando perto de uma discussão sobre a legitimidade do sistema eleitoral brasileiro, porque isso fique bastante claro.
Muito bom, muito bom. Boa nota de rodapé. The questions are in English, so you don't need the simultaneous translation. There is a question by Murilo Gaiolas, and the question is twofold. First is the question about whether Donald Trump can simply kick out federal servants and replace them with political appointees. How far that can go in the deep state, so to speak, right? And whether protections, legal protections. The other is about what are the chances that Donald Trump can change the Constitution and be allowed to run for a third term, whether this is a controversial issue or a settled issue in the U.S., right? There is also a question about, this is the question that came from Ronaldo Jarnik. It's the question about after being elected, representatives kind of sort of, they forget about their constituencies and they do whatever they want. And 2 or 4 times, 4 years later, they try to get the votes again. I wonder this is the case in the U.S., so that especially for the House of Representatives that you have every 2 years, you have elections for the House in the U.S. How close is the link? One thing that calls my attention is that the level of turnout in the level of turnover in the U.S. House of Representatives is much lower than here. So the incumbents get reelected most of the time, right? As far as I remember, around 80%, the average, historical average, which maybe speaks volumes about that disconnection is very strong, right? Does this part of the electoral system work in the U.S. or does it not? And there are other questions, but I think those are enough for today.
I can be pretty quick on these. Can Trump kick out federal servants? Yes, because as president, he controls the executive agencies. And so, so much of American democracy relies on norms, not explicit rules. And Trump has broken norms left and right. And so, yes, he has the authority to do that. Can Trump change the Constitution so he can run for a third term? No. The 22nd Amendment says that presidents cannot serve more than 2 terms, and that's very clear. There's really no. I think maybe the one argument he would try to make is that it means consecutive terms, but that has never been the understanding. I don't think even the Supreme Court would agree with that. So you would need a constitutional amendment, which again requires 3/4 of the votes in each chamber of Congress, 2/3 of the votes in each chamber of Congress and 3/4 of the states ratifying, and that's not going to happen. If his interpretation, if he tried to make the interpretation that it's 2 consecutive terms, well, then why doesn't Barack Obama run for election again? That's just that. I don't think anyone would agree with that. I didn't think anyone would agree with at least that interpretation of the 22nd Amendment. And then, do legislators forget about their constituents? So every October, we have elections in November. Every October, I happen to receive in the mail a nice letter and brochure from my member of Congress telling me everything that he's done as a constituent service. Hey, just want to let you know, here's what I've been doing on your behalf in Congress. Interesting that the timing of that mailer, and it's government funded because he's mailing an informational pamphlet to the constituents. It always seems to come in the middle of October. And so, yes, I think it is true that incumbents are reelected most of the time. Now, part of that has to do with partisan gerrymandering, because of partisan gerrymandering and the drawing of districts, we basically know for so many districts that, because they're drawn just with a skew of which party controls that district, that the candidate from one party or the other is going to win. I mean, you have a lot of elections where one of the parties doesn't even put up a challenger because they know they have no chance. Who would want to run and spend the money and time campaigning in an election where they have no chance of winning if you're a Democrat in a strongly Republican district? And so the primaries become the most important election. But primaries have very low turnout. Only the most polarized voters typically vote in the primaries. And so that's why you have, the extreme on the left, like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right, a very extreme member of Congress from the right, because the primaries are the main game in those districts. And so the candidates become even more further left or further right to win those primaries. And then if you're an incumbent running for re-election, well, you win the primary, you're going to win the general election. It's just not even, basically not a question. And it's much harder to defeat an incumbent in the primary. So yes, I do think that the incumbents, they are re-elected most of the time. I think there is often a disconnect between them and their constituents, except for in October, when all of a sudden many people start hearing from their member of Congress.
All right, thank you, Josh. So one final remark. I think it's a kind of odd feeling that I think we all have. If voting is, the right to vote is a fundamental right that needs to be. Now it's on. It has to be protected, and it's not protected enough in the U.S. I think it's better protected here, clearly, by far, and this is hugely important. On the other hand, I think we have to reckon to the fact that elections are a very complicated game, and this idea that people can deeply understand politics, can understand what are the options on the table, so to speak, can differentiate between candidates on the basis of their policy preferences. This is theoretically very attractive, but when you look at the empirical data, this is not what happens in reality. I'm reading just final comment. It's a suggestion. I don't know whether you know the book, Democracy for Realists. Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government by Bartels and a co-author. And it's worth reading because all the empirical studies show, most of them, show that the idea that you have rational voters, well-informed rational voters, who choose their candidates based on well-informed rational choice is simply not true when you look at the empirical data. There is a long empirical study on the correlation between the state of the economy and voting in the U.S. And normally the main finding is that there is a strong correlation between the state of the economy a few months before election. So people have difficulty in sort of basing their votes in terms of analyzing the performance of this or that incumbent along the whole term in office. So they're based in a very short period of time, which is not necessarily the more rational, a well-informed way to vote. So there is this thing that is does not mean that the elections are not hugely important in terms of selecting the elites and allowing competition between the elites, allowing that people do not cling to power forever and ever. But this idea, that's the basic theory, a democratic theory, that government reflects well-thought preferences of the electorate. This is not what it is, and I think this is we have to reckon. So when you complain about voters' choices, I mean, sorry, that's the way it is. Yeah.
So if I can just add a couple of responses to that important point. One of the statistics that I could not believe coming from this election a couple weeks ago is that of the voters who said democracy was their most important issue, Donald Trump still won the majority of those voters. That shocked me. And I think it's in part because of the propaganda that suggested that Harris would be anti-democracy. But it also goes to the number one issue was not democracy that people voted on, even though the Democrats tried to make that an issue in January 6th insurrection. It was the economy. And even though inflation had gone down by October, the people still voted based on how they viewed the economy from a couple months before. And I think the other point to make in response that you sort of touched on is the importance of civics education. I've been interested to learn that there's not a lot of civics education in the schools here. We do have civics education in the U.S., but it's not that good. I think we need to totally revamp the way we think about teaching children, students about democracy, but also throughout adulthood. And if I could just mention an organization that I really like, that I'm involved with in my city of Lexington, Kentucky, called Civic Lex. And Civic Lex bills itself as a civic health organization. And so if you think of, public health as thinking about people's, the public's, response to pandemics or other health issues, civic health is the same thing. How does the public engage in politics and government in a healthy way? And this organization does some amazing things, like brings people together from different parts of the city, from different viewpoints, is very intentional about the groups of people that it brings together to have conversations about issues that city residents care about, like how should the parks be funded, or how should urban development proceed? And you have people talking to each other in a meaningful way. In the U.S., our civics education in schools is basically memorize what the three branches of government do and memorize the Declaration of Independence. And that stuff is not engaging. We need to totally rewire how we're thinking about this commitment to democracy, both in K through 12 and in adulthood through organizations like CivicLex, which is really the only organization of its kind in the U.S. To engage people in what government actually does, and not just the facts about it, but how it affects people.
This is really a final remark. But you addressed in a way, you addressed a question asked by Gustavo Amaral, which is how to restore the credibility of democracy. And I think it's bottom up, and it's local politics, where you can sort of bring together real people to talk about real political issues at the local level, right? So that you can sort of reconstruct the social fabric, right? But how you reconcile this with the internet and social media. Finland has started to teach at kindergarten media literacy to kids, right? In order to for citizens to, I mean, civics shall start really at a very young age. So, Josh, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. Flavio, once again, huge thanks for making this possible. Tatiana, Thaís, pardon. Eu ando errando o nome. Outro dia, alguns assistiram aqui, eu estava mediando um debate com o doutor Milton Cerotti, acho. Eu o chamei de Márcio. Ele era Márcio ou Milton? Eu fiz uma confusão inominável. Então, Thaís, desculpa, não é nada pessoal. Zé Wellington, muito obrigado pela presença, pelos comentários. Obrigado a todos e todas que ficaram até agora aqui conosco, não só fisicamente, como quem nos assistiu online. Muito obrigado. Até a próxima.
Obrigado.